A biker walked into the small-town diner, slapped an 81-year-old veteran, and thought he'd get away with it. 22 minutes later, the sound of diesel engines outside told him his day was about to change forever. You could have heard a pin drop. One moment, Earl Jennings was sipping his coffee, chatting about the weather with the waitress. The next, the sharp crack of a biker's hand meeting his cheek cut through the air like a gunshot. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks hung in mid-air. Every pair of eyes in Mel's Country Diner locked on the same table. Booth number 4, near the window. Earl didn't move right away. The sting spread across his face, but he stayed still, his hand resting on the edge of the table. At 81, he'd been through worse, much worse, but something about this hit was different. It wasn't just the physical blow, it was the disrespect. The complete disregard for everything he had given to this country. Travis Murdoch stood over him, his leather jacket creaking as he shifted his weight. A jagged patch on his sleeve read, Iron Jackals MC, a biker club locals knew to steer clear of. He wasn't a stranger here. Henderson, Tennessee, was too small for strangers, but folks kept their distance. Murdoch had a habit of finding trouble and making it stick. "What's the matter, old man?" Murdoch sneered, nodding toward the Vietnam service medals pinned to Earl's cap. "Think that makes you special?" "That was a long time ago. No one cares." Earl's voice was calm, but steady. "You've said enough. Move along." But Murdoch didn't move along. He leaned closer, close enough for Earl to catch the sour tang of stale beer on his breath. And then, without warning, the slap came. Hard, loud, public. The room went still. The waitress, a petite woman in her 30s named Carla, stepped forward but froze when one of Murdoch's friends, a hulking man with tattoos crawling up his neck, shot her a warning look. "You're crossing the line, Travis," called out a man at the counter, his voice low but firm. He was ignored. Earl didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to stand. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his faded army green jacket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately. One short message. 2 words. "Come now." He set the phone down beside his plate, picked up his coffee, and took another sip. His hand didn't shake. Murdoch laughed, glancing around as if expecting the room to join in. No one did. Instead, eyes darted between Earl and the biker, waiting to see what would happen next. "You think calling someone's gonna save you?" Murdoch taunted, his voice carrying to the far end of the diner. "Ain't nobody gonna walk in here and tell me what to do?" Earl didn't reply. He'd learned long ago that silence could be louder than shouting. Across the diner, a teenager in a baseball cap whispered to his mother, "Isn't he the guy from the Veterans Hall?" She shushed him quickly, pulling her phone out. The seconds dragged. Murdoch took a seat at a nearby table, his friends flanking him. They ordered coffee from Carla as if nothing had happened. She poured it without a word, her lips pressed tight. Earl kept his eyes on the window. Out on Main Street, traffic was light. A pickup truck rolled by. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. He knew it would take time, but not much. The man at the counter leaned toward Earl's booth. "You sure you don't want me to call Sheriff Beckett?" he asked quietly. Earl shook his head. "No need. Someone's coming." The man looked like he wanted to press the point, but something in Earl's expression told him not to. At the far end of the diner, Murdoch's voice rose again. He was telling a story, loud and exaggerated, about some bar fight in Memphis. His friends laughed at every line, whether it was funny or not, but the laughter felt forced. Even they sensed the tension in the air. Earl's phone buzzed once on the table. He glanced at the screen, then slid it back into his pocket. No change in expression, just the faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth. Somewhere outside, a diesel engine grumbled in the distance. But in here, no one spoke about it yet. But that low, steady sound was about to change everything inside Mel's Country Diner. The slap was over in seconds, but the weight of it lingered like smoke that wouldn't clear. Conversations stayed muted, voices barely above a whisper. The regulars in the back kept glancing toward Earl's booth, unsure whether they were looking at a man biding his time or an old veteran silently swallowing his pride. Earl sat upright, shoulders squared, coffee cup in hand. His expression didn't shift. He looked more like someone waiting for a late bus than a man who'd just been humiliated in front of 24 people. That composure was what kept everyone glued to their seats. It was unsettling in its own quiet way, the kind of stillness that meant something was brewing. Murdoch leaned back in his chair, boots propped on another, sipping coffee as if he owned the place. Every now and then he'd toss a smirk toward Earl, waiting for a reaction that never came. One of his friends, the tattooed one, kept scanning the diner, locking eyes with anyone who stared too long. Carla, still rattled, busied herself wiping tables that didn't need wiping. When she passed by Earl's booth, she lowered her voice. "Do you want me to call someone?" Earl's gaze stayed on the street outside. Already did. Her eyes followed his to the window. Nothing out there yet but the occasional passing car. At the counter, the man who had spoken up earlier, Phil McLean, a retired trucker, muttered to the older gentleman next to him, "If I were his age, and someone smacked me like that." "You're not him," the man cut in sharply. "And you've never been to war." That shut Phil up for the moment. Minutes slid by, slow but heavy. The clink of silverware was the only real sound, apart from the squeak of Carla's sneakers on the tile. Outside, a gust of wind stirred a paper cup along the curb. Earl's phone stayed in his jacket pocket now. He didn't check it again. Instead, he traced a finger along the edge of his plate, like he was thinking of anything but the man sitting 15 feet away. In truth, his thoughts were precise, measured. He knew exactly how long it would take. Henderson wasn't a sprawling city. The National Guard facility was just outside of town. And if his son, no, when his son, saw that message, he wouldn't waste a second. Inside the diner, the tension sat thick in the air. Murdoch finished his coffee and waved for a refill. Carla filled it without meeting his eyes. "You pour coffee like you're scared of spilling it." Murdoch joked loudly. She didn't respond, and the room stayed quiet. Phil finally turned in his seat, speaking across the diner. "Travis, why don't you just leave him alone? You've made your point." Murdoch's smile widened. "Point? Oh, Phil, I've barely started." Earl finally moved his gaze from the window to Murdoch. "You're done," he said simply. Murdoch's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. "Old man, you don't get to decide that." The bell above the diner's front door jingled as a young couple stepped inside, stopping mid-step when they felt the tension in the room. They slid into a booth in the corner, whispering to each other. Outside, another diesel engine rolled past, closer this time. But again, no one commented. Carla walked by Phil and muttered under her breath, "Feels like we're waiting for something." Phil kept his eyes on Earl. "We are." Murdoch caught that and barked a laugh. "What's coming, huh? You think someone's gonna roll in here and—" He stopped when Earl set his coffee cup down with a quiet click on the saucer. That was all. No words, just that small, deliberate sound. The tattooed biker glanced at Murdoch, a flicker of uncertainty passing between them. More minutes passed. People shifted in their seats. Carla refilled coffee no one was drinking. The teenager from earlier kept sneaking glances at Earl, like trying to piece together how this would end. Then, faint but growing, there it was again. The low rumble outside. Louder now. Steady. Unmistakable. Phil turned his head toward the window. "Hear that?" he murmured. Earl didn't answer, but Murdoch's smirk had already started to fade, and everyone in the diner could feel the shift coming. Just a few miles away, inside the National Guard training facility on the edge of Henderson, the day had been moving like clockwork. Sergeant Calvin Ricks, retired U.S. Army after 20 years, was halfway through a briefing with 7 of his old platoon brothers. They'd gathered for a joint training exercise, something they did twice a year to keep sharp and keep bonds strong. Calvin's phone sat face down on the table. When it buzzed, he didn't think much of it, until he saw the name. Dad. 2 words glowed on the screen. "Come now." That was all. No explanation, no punctuation. But Calvin knew his father's style. Earl Jennings didn't waste words, and he didn't call for help unless the situation called for it. This wasn't the sort of message you ignored or sent a thumbs up to. Calvin stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the concrete floor. "I need a minute," he told the group, already moving toward the door. "What's up?" asked Thomas Vega, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and a quiet voice that rarely asked questions. Calvin didn't break stride. "My father's in trouble." Vega's eyes sharpened. "Where?" "Mel's Diner." That was enough. The others exchanged looks, and without needing a formal request, they began moving, grabbing jackets, caps, and keys. In their years of service together, they'd learned to read urgency without details. By the time Calvin reached his pickup, Vega was sliding into the passenger seat. Behind them, 2 other trucks fired up. The low thrum of diesel engines echoed in the small parking lot. As they pulled onto Main Street, Calvin's grip tightened on the wheel. "It's Travis Murdoch," he said finally. "It's gotta be. Dad wouldn't call me unless it was serious, and that guy's been trouble since the day he got here." Vega gave a short nod. "You want me to call Sheriff Beckett?" "No," Calvin replied. "Not yet. I'm not letting my dad sit there another 30 minutes waiting for some official report to get filed. We'll see what's what first." They drove in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, but focused. Calvin's mind was already running scenarios, what he might find, how Murdoch might react, how to keep things from boiling over while still making it clear Earl wasn't a man to be disrespected. In the truck behind them, Patrick Doolin rolled down his window and shouted over the engine noise. "You think this is gonna get physical?" Calvin didn't answer right away. "Depends on Murdoch," he finally said. "But one way or another, he's going to learn something today." The convoy of 3 trucks wound through town, drawing more than a few curious looks from pedestrians. People in Henderson weren't used to seeing 8 men built like walls moving together with purpose. They made the last turn onto Main Street. The neon sign of Mel's Country Diner flickered ahead. From here, Calvin could see his father through the front window. Same booth, same posture, coffee cup in hand. Murdoch sat a few tables away, head tilted back in laughter at something one of his friends had said. Calvin parked hard but precise, the truck's tires kissing the curb. The 2 other trucks slid into place behind him. Doors opened almost in unison. Boots hit pavement. Inside the diner, heads began to turn. Carla's hand froze mid-pour as she caught sight of them through the glass. Phil muttered something under his breath. Calvin adjusted his cap and pushed open the door. The jingle of the bell was sharp against the muffled chatter. He stepped inside first, his platoon brothers fanning out just behind him, not in a threatening circle, but in a way that made it impossible to ignore their presence. "Morning, Dad," Calvin said, his voice even. Earl looked up and gave a single nod. "Cal," Murdoch's eyes flicked between father and son, his smirk faltering just a hair. Vega stopped near the counter, resting one arm casually on it, while the others positioned themselves at different points around the room. No one said a word yet, but the energy shifted. Calvin moved toward Earl's booth, his steps slow but steady. He didn't look at Murdoch right away, not until he'd reached the table. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Earl replied. "But this man here doesn't understand respect." Calvin finally turned his gaze to Murdoch. "Is that right?" Murdoch leaned back in his chair, forcing a laugh. "This your boy? Thought he'd be bigger." A couple of Murdoch's friends chuckled nervously. Calvin didn't blink. "I'm plenty big enough." But the way he said it made the diner feel smaller, and even Murdoch's friends could sense the air getting heavier. Calvin didn't take his eyes off Murdoch, but he was aware of every movement in the room. Vega stayed near the counter, arms folded, his eyes sweeping the diner like a man scanning a battlefield. Doolin and Carter took seats at an empty booth, angled just enough to keep Murdoch in sight without making it obvious. The others stood or leaned casually against walls, but there was nothing casual about their posture. Murdoch glanced at each of them, trying to size up what he was dealing with. He recognized soldiers when he saw them. These weren't kids playing dress-up. These men had been places he hadn't, and they carried themselves like it. "Looks like you brought an audience," Murdoch said, raising his voice just enough for the whole diner to hear. Calvin slid into the booth across from his father, his movements deliberate, measured. "No, I brought witnesses." A ripple of reaction moved through the room. Carla set down the coffee pot on the counter, keeping her distance but staying close enough to see and hear everything. Phil McLean spoke up from the counter. Travis, maybe it's time you left. Murdoch shot him a glare. I'll leave when I'm ready. Calvin's voice stayed calm. You're ready now? That earned a few quick glances from the regulars. Calvin's tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It was the kind of voice that made you listen without realizing you'd leaned in. Murdoch laughed again, but it didn't land the way he wanted. His friends were quieter now, their eyes darting between him and the men who had just walked in. Your old man's got a smart mouth, Murdoch said. Guess it runs in the family. Calvin didn't smile. My father's earned the right to say whatever he wants. You? Not so much. The tension tightened another notch. Vega shifted his stance, not aggressively, but enough to draw Murdoch's attention for a second. Earl finally set his coffee cup down and looked at Murdoch directly. Do you know what it's like to hold a man's hand while he's dying and promise him you'll make it home? I do. I've done it more than once. And I came back here to live in peace, not to get slapped in the face by some man looking to feel bigger than he is. Murdoch opened his mouth to respond, but Calvin cut in. You slapped an 81-year-old veteran in front of a room full of people. And now you're sitting here like you've done something worth being proud of. That's not how this is going to end. Outside, the late morning sun caught on the chrome bumpers of the trucks lined up at the curb. A small crowd had begun to gather, curious about the sudden arrival of 3 military-grade pickups in front of Mel's. A couple of onlookers pressed their faces to the glass, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. Murdoch shifted in his seat, his confidence slipping in tiny cracks. What, you're going to throw me out, all of you? Calvin leaned forward slightly. We don't need to throw you out. You're going to walk out on your own, and before you do, you're going to apologize to my father. Murdoch scoffed. Not a chance. The room seemed to hold its breath. Vega's voice broke the silence. Then you're going to make this a whole lot harder on yourself than it has to be. Murdoch's friends exchanged uneasy glances. One of them shifted in his chair, like maybe he was reconsidering whether he wanted to be here at all. Carla finally spoke from the counter, her voice steady, but low. Travis, just say you're sorry and go. Nobody wants this to get worse. For a moment it looked like he might. His jaw worked, his eyes flicking from Earl to Calvin to the men scattered around the diner. But then his pride snapped back into place. I'm not apologizing for anything. Calvin didn't move, didn't raise his voice. Then you'd better be ready for the kind of trouble you can't swagger your way out of. The bell over the door jingled as another man stepped inside, not part of Calvin's group, but a local who took one look at the scene and quietly took a seat near the door, as if ready to watch how it played out. Murdoch's bravado was wearing thin, and it showed in the way his fingers tapped against his coffee cup. He wasn't laughing anymore. But instead of pushing it further right away, Calvin let the silence stretch, knowing that sometimes a pause could weigh more than a punch. The silence in the diner had shifted. It wasn't the tense, uncertain quiet from before Calvin arrived. This was heavier, more pointed, as if the air itself was waiting to see who would flinch first. Calvin sat across from Earl, his elbows resting on the table, eyes fixed on Murdoch. You've got 2 choices, he said evenly. Stand up, make it right, and walk out of here with what little pride you've got left, or sit there and keep pretending you're the toughest man in the room. Murdoch forced a smirk, but his shoulders gave away the truth. A slight hunch, like the weight of the eyes on him was starting to press down. You think you scare me? No, Calvin replied. I think you know exactly who we are, and that's why you can't stop talking. That got a few quiet chuckles from Vega and the others, though no one moved closer. They didn't need to. Their presence was the message. Earl's voice cut through, calm but edged with steel. Travis, I don't need your fear. I need your respect. And if you can't give it, you're going to learn why you should have. Murdoch leaned forward, trying to reclaim ground. Respect's earned, old man. Earl didn't blink. Then you just proved you've never earned any. The words landed like a slap of their own. A couple of patrons shifted in their seats, eyes widening. Carla stopped wiping a table halfway, watching from the corner. Murdoch's friends weren't laughing anymore. The tattooed one spoke up, though his voice lacked conviction. Look, maybe we just finish our coffee and go. Murdoch shot him a glare, but the crack was widening. His crew wasn't as sure as he was trying to appear. Calvin stood, slow and deliberate, pushing his chair back without breaking eye contact. "Here's the thing," he said. "You walk out of here without apologizing, and everyone in this room will remember you as the guy who slapped a veteran and ran from the consequences. You apologize, you get to walk out with your head high, and maybe folks think you made a bad call but were man enough to own it. Either way, this ends with you walking out. The choice is yours." Murdoch looked at the men around the diner. Big, disciplined, unmoving. None of them had touched him, but their stillness was a wall he couldn't break through. "You brought a whole army for this," he muttered. Calvin didn't look away. "No, they were already with me. That's the difference between you and us. When one of ours calls, we come." Earl's eyes softened for the first time that morning. He didn't smile, but there was pride in his gaze. Phil at the counter decided to throw in his own jab. "Travis, if you're smart, you'll take the easy way out. Otherwise, you'll be a story people tell for years, and you won't like how it ends." Murdoch's hand twitched near his cup. For a second, it looked like he might slam it down and stand, but instead he sat back, arms crossed. "Maybe I don't care what people say." Calvin took a single step closer. "You will." The words were soft, but they carried like they'd been spoken through a megaphone. Even the young couple in the corner booth sat frozen, barely breathing. Murdoch's bravado cracked again. He shifted in his seat, glanced at the door, then back at Calvin. "And if I don't?" Vega spoke up from his post by the counter. "Then you'll find out what it feels like to be the smallest man in the room without anyone laying a finger on you." That hit differently. Murdoch's friends weren't meeting his eyes now. The tattooed one leaned toward him and muttered something too low for the others to catch. Whatever it was, it made Murdoch's jaw tighten. Earl leaned forward just slightly. "I've faced men overseas who thought they could take whatever they wanted because they had a weapon in their hand. You don't have one, Travis. All you've got is your mouth, and it's writing checks you can't cash." The insult landed clean. Murdoch's mouth opened, but no words came out. Outside, someone from the small crowd knocked lightly on the window, curious about the standoff. Heads turned toward the sound, but Calvin's eyes stayed locked on Murdoch. "Last time I'm saying it," Calvin said. "Stand up, look him in the eye, say you're sorry, then leave." But the longer Murdoch sat there, the more it became clear he was running out of room to maneuver, and even he could feel the wall. Murdoch shifted in his seat again, this time leaning back as if he was trying to reclaim space that wasn't his anymore. The leather of his jacket creaked when he crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing at Calvin. "So that's it, huh? You think you can just walk in here with your little military parade and tell me how it's gonna go?" Calvin didn't raise his voice. "No, I'm not telling you how it's gonna go. I'm telling you how it will go." That subtle difference landed harder than a shout. The diner seemed to lean in, even the background noises, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint clink of cutlery, fading under the weight of the exchange. Murdoch's lips curled into a half smile. "You know, I've had people try to intimidate me before. Never worked." Earl's tone was low but firm. "That's because they were trying. He's not." The statement made Murdoch glance at Earl with a flicker of irritation, but it was the truth in Calvin's calm demeanor that made him shift in his seat again. Patrick Doolin, still seated in the booth with Carter, finally spoke up. "You ever been in a room where you're the only one who doesn't understand the rules? That's where you're sitting now, Murdoch." Murdoch's jaw worked, but he didn't answer. He scanned the room, maybe looking for an ally, maybe looking for a way out. Calvin took a slow step closer. "I'll give you a chance," he said. "Stand up, say you're sorry, and walk away. No one follows you, no one touches you. You get to pretend this never happened." "And if I don't?" Murdoch asked, his voice trying to sound casual, but the edge was there. "Then," Calvin said, "you stay seated while every person in this room, and probably half the county by tonight, remembers you as the man who slapped an 81-year-old veteran and had to be babysat out of a diner." A ripple of low laughter passed through a couple of booths. Murdoch's cheeks flushed. "You think that matters to me?" he asked. "It will," Vega said from his post near the counter. Because when you walk into the hardware store, or the gas station, or that bar you like on 5th Street, every eye will be on you, and you'll know why. Earl leaned back in his seat, letting his son take the lead, but his gaze never left Murdoch. You're young enough to make different choices, Travis, but pride's a heavy thing to carry when you've already lost. The tattooed friend finally broke his silence. Travis, maybe just do it. This isn't worth it. Shut up, Murdoch snapped, but the crack in his armor had widened. His friend leaned back, lips pressed tight, done trying to defend him. The young couple in the corner exchanged a glance. The man whispered something to his partner, and she shook her head, eyes glued to the scene. Even the sound of a fork hitting a plate somewhere in the back felt loud in the stillness. Calvin stepped right up to Murdoch's table now, not crowding him, but close enough that Murdoch had to tilt his head up. You had your fun. Now you're going to make it right. Murdoch looked away, eyes darting toward the door as though calculating a quick exit. But with Calvin between him and the exit, and 3 trucks worth of former soldiers scattered through the diner, running didn't feel like a real option. Carla, standing behind the counter, finally spoke again. Travis, enough. Just do the right thing. You've been coming in here for years. Don't be remembered like this. Her voice softened the moment, but it didn't change the fact that all eyes were still on him. Murdoch tapped the table once with his fingers, then twice. He let out a breath, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. And what if I say no? Calvin's voice didn't change. Then I'll spend the next 20 minutes telling you exactly what my father did for this country, and exactly what I've done. And you'll sit there and listen, because we'll make sure you do. And every person here will hear it too, and they'll remember that you stayed in your seat because you didn't have the courage to stand up. The words weren't shouted, but they hit harder than any physical threat could have. Murdoch's eyes darted to Earl, who was watching him like a man who'd already seen how this ended. But before Murdoch could answer, Calvin's tone shifted, softer now, but more dangerous. And that was when the real challenge began. Calvin's voice dropped low, almost conversational, but the words carried in the stillness. You think this is about you and me? It's not. This is about what my father represents. You slapped him, Travis, but it wasn't just a slap. You slapped every man and woman who's ever put on a uniform and done their job without asking for a medal in return. Earl stayed quiet, but his eyes never left Murdoch. The look wasn't hateful. It was the steady gaze of a man who'd seen real battles and knew this one was only about ego. Calvin stepped back half a pace, giving Murdoch room as if to say, here's your chance. But Murdoch stayed planted in his seat, fingers gripping the edge of the table. Vega moved forward slightly, resting one hand on the back of a nearby chair. You're sitting here pretending you've got nothing to lose. Truth is, you've got more than you realize. Reputation's a currency in a small town. You burn through it, and pretty soon you can't buy your way out of a paper bag. Patrick Doolin leaned forward in his booth, voice calm, but with a sharper edge. Right now, people still think you're just acting tough. But if you don't fix this, they'll know you're just weak. And that'll stick longer than anything else. Murdoch glanced between them, his smirk gone now. His friends avoided eye contact altogether. The tattooed one stared at his coffee like it might give him an excuse to leave. Earl finally spoke, his tone steady as ever. When I was your age, I thought I had something to prove. I learned quick that the men worth following never needed to say they were in charge. People knew it because of how they treated others. You don't get that yet, but maybe you will someday. Murdoch let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging just enough to notice. So what? You want me to stand up here in front of everyone and act like I'm sorry? Calvin's eyes narrowed. Acting's what you've been doing since you walked in. I'm telling you to mean it. That landed hard. Murdoch's jaw flexed, but he didn't speak right away. From the counter, Phil McLean decided to add his own weight. Travis, there's 2 kinds of men in this world. The kind that can look someone in the eye and admit they're wrong, and the kind that dies inside pretending they're always right. You're choosing which one you're gonna be right now. Carla leaned against the counter, arms folded. We've all had bad days, Travis. This doesn't have to be the worst one of your life, unless you make it that way. Murdoch finally looked at Earl, Not at Calvin, not at the soldiers scattered through the diner, just Earl. The old man sat steady, eyes clear, hands resting calmly on the table. No gloating. No need for it. You ever think maybe people just don't respect you? Murdoch asked, though the bite was gone from his voice. Earl didn't hesitate. Respect isn't something you get for free. You earn it, day after day. But it's also something you can lose in a single moment. That line seemed to hang in the air. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. A few people were filming through the glass now, phones angled toward the standoff. Murdoch's eyes flicked toward the window, realizing that whatever he did next might be seen far beyond this small town. Vega spoke again, his tone almost casual. Thing about moments like this. They don't just go away. You'll remember them. Everyone will. Question is, will you remember it because you did the right thing? Or because you couldn't? Murdoch sat back, the tension in his body shifting. His pride was still there, but it was being slowly chipped away, not by force, but by the unshakable certainty in the people surrounding him. Earl leaned forward just slightly. This isn't about making you small. It's about making you understand there's a better way to walk out that door than the one you're thinking of. The words hit their mark. Murdoch exhaled, long and slow, his eyes dropping for the first time since Calvin had walked in. But before anyone could say the word apology, Murdoch's hand gripped the edge of the table, and it wasn't clear whether he was about to stand up in surrender or double down. For a long moment, Murdoch didn't move. His hand stayed on the table's edge, knuckles pale, his jaw tight. The room was so still that the faint hum of the ceiling fan suddenly felt louder, like it was marking each second that passed. Calvin stayed where he was, eyes locked on Murdoch, giving him the space to make a choice. "You've got one clean exit here," he said quietly. "Don't waste it." Murdoch's eyes flicked to Earl again. The old man hadn't changed his posture. He sat there with the patience of someone who'd waited out far worse. That calm was worse than any threat. It said, "You can't shake me." Outside, the crowd peered in through the windows, phones still up, recording. Murdoch noticed them and shifted uncomfortably. Whatever happened here, it was going to live beyond the walls of Mel's diner. His tattooed friend leaned closer, speaking just loud enough for him to hear. "Travis, enough, man. This ain't worth it. Just do it." The other biker didn't say a word, but his expression made it clear he agreed. Finally, Murdoch pushed back his chair. The scrape of metal legs against tile cut through the room. He stood up slowly, as if the weight of the choice had added years to his frame. He didn't look at Calvin. He didn't look at the soldiers. He looked straight at Earl. "I was out of line," he said, his voice rough, but loud enough for the diner to hear. "Shouldn't have put my hands on you." Earl didn't move at first, then gave a single nod. "Respect starts there." Murdoch swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." The words came out stiff, like they'd been forced past a barrier, but they were there. Carla, who had been holding her breath, let it out slowly. Phil gave the faintest approving nod from the counter. The young couple in the corner exchanged a quick glance, as if they'd just watched a live scene from a movie. Calvin's gaze stayed on Murdoch. "You done?" Murdoch hesitated, then added, "Didn't mean to disrespect your service. I just wasn't thinking." Earl's voice was steady. "Thinking or not, you fix things by owning them. You did that." For a beat, the two men just looked at each other. No handshake, no forced gesture, just the acknowledgement that the moment had shifted. Murdoch turned toward the door, but Calvin's voice stopped him. "Travis," the biker froze. "You're gonna remember this," Calvin said, not as a threat, but as a certainty. "Next time you feel like proving yourself, ask whether you're proving strength, or just trying to hide weakness." Murdoch didn't answer. He walked out, his friends trailing behind him. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped into the daylight. Outside, the gathered crowd parted to let them through. Some of the onlookers filmed their exit, while others just watched in silence. The rumble of motorcycle engines broke the quiet as the three bikers mounted up and rode off down Main Street. Inside, it was as if the diner itself exhaled. Conversations started up again, tentative at first, then growing louder. Carla picked up the coffee pot and began making her rounds, pouring for customers who now seemed eager to fill the space with normalcy. Earl reached for his coffee again, took a sip, and set it back down. "Well," he said softly. "That's over." Calvin slid back into the booth across from him. "Not just yet. Word's gonna get around before the coffee's cold." Vega leaned on the counter, looking at Earl. "You handled that better than most would have." Earl gave a small shrug. "Didn't need to raise my voice. Just needed him to see there was no winning where he was headed." Phil chuckled. "Guess he saw it clear enough." Earl looked toward the window, where the crowd was starting to thin. "Clear enough for today. We'll see about tomorrow." Calvin followed his gaze, but his attention came back to his father. "You ready to finish breakfast?" Earl smiled faintly. "Always." But outside, a few faces in the dispersing crowd still lingered, not out of curiosity, but because they'd just witnessed a moment they'd be talking about for years. Once the bikers were gone, the sound of their engines fading down Main Street, the diner began to settle, but not into its old rhythm. This wasn't the same room it had been 40 minutes ago. There was an undercurrent now, a quiet awareness that everyone had just shared something they wouldn't forget. Carla topped off Earl's coffee again, this time without the tremor in her hand. "On the house," she said. Earl gave her a nod. "Appreciate it." At the counter, Phil turned in his stool to face Calvin. "You handled that clean. Didn't lay a hand on him, but you still walked him right out the door." Calvin shrugged. "Wasn't about throwing punches. He needed to see what happens when you mess with the wrong man. And sometimes the wrong man isn't the one who's standing in front of you. It's the people who will stand behind him." Vega smirked from his spot near the counter. You could tell he was looking for a way out about halfway through. His pride just kept getting in the way. "That's usually how it works," Earl said. He picked up his fork and took a bite of his now cold biscuits and gravy, like the entire confrontation had just been an interruption to breakfast. The young couple in the corner finally stood to leave. On their way out, the man stopped by Earl's booth. "Sir, my grandfather served in Vietnam. I just want to say, I'm sorry you went through that, and thank you for your service." Earl met his eyes, offering a simple, "Your grandfather's welcome. So are you." After they left, Calvin leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "You know, word's going to get around fast. Henderson's small, and that crowd outside, half of them probably already posted it online." Earl didn't seem fazed. "Let it. Maybe it'll make the next guy think twice." Carla returned to wipe down the now empty table the bikers had left behind. "Not sure I've ever seen Travis Murdoch leave without a smart comment. You pulled something off today." Calvin shook his head. "Dad pulled it off. I just showed up." Patrick Doolin and Carter walked over from their booth. "We're heading back to base," Doolin said. "But next time you text us, maybe give a heads up if we're walking into a standoff in the middle of breakfast service." Calvin chuckled. "I'll keep that in mind." The soldiers began filing out one by one, offering nods to Earl before stepping into the sunlight. The crowd outside had mostly dispersed, though a few curious locals lingered, chatting in small clusters. Phil stayed at the counter, turning the story over in his head. "Gonna be hard for Travis to show his face at the VFW after this." Earl sipped his coffee. "If he does, maybe he'll keep his hands to himself next time." Vega paused at the door, glancing back at Earl. "You know, not every father would have a son who'd drop everything and bring backup." Earl's expression softened. Just a hint. "Not every father's as lucky as I am." Calvin smiled at that, but didn't say anything. Outside, the sun was high now, casting sharp light on the trucks still parked at the curb. A few people passing by slowed their steps to glance inside, as if trying to imagine the moment they'd already missed. Carla slid the check onto the table, but Earl pushed it back. "Put it on my tab. And add the coffee for these guys too." She looked at Calvin. "You sticking around?" "Just long enough to make sure he finishes his breakfast," Calvin replied. Earl gave him a side eye. "You know I can take care of myself." "I know," Calvin said. "But sometimes it's not about whether you can. It's about showing people you're not alone." They ate in a comfortable quiet for a few minutes, the kind that follows a storm. The other customers slowly returned to their meals, though every so often someone's gaze would wander back to Earl, as if checking to confirm he was really as unshaken as he looked. By the time they stood to leave, the diner felt different, Not safer exactly. Henderson was already a safe place, but more aware. Like a reminder had been planted that morning about what respect looked like when it was defended the right way. But Earl knew as he stepped out into the sunlight that moments like this don't fade. They grow legs, travel fast, and change the way people act for a long time afterward. By the time Earl and Calvin stepped outside, the last of the crowd had gone. Only a few stray footprints on the sidewalk hinted at the audience that had been there less than an hour ago. The 3 trucks were still parked along the curb, sun glinting off their chrome. Calvin walked a few paces ahead, scanning the street like it was second nature. Earl followed at his own steady pace, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other adjusting the bill of his cap. "You know this is going to be all over the internet by tonight," Calvin said without looking back. Earl gave a faint shrug. "Then maybe someone out there will get the message without having to live it first." They reached the trucks, but neither man made a move to climb in just yet. Calvin leaned against the driver's side door. "You could have called the sheriff. Could have told him to haul Murdoch out and press charges. Why call me?" Earl met his gaze. "Because I didn't need an arrest. I needed a lesson. One he'd remember. And I knew you'd bring the kind of men who teach lessons without throwing fists." Calvin thought about that for a moment. "You think it'll stick?" Earl nodded. "It'll stick. Maybe not enough to change him completely, but enough to make him think twice. That's all you can do for some people. Make them think twice." A breeze moved down Main Street, carrying the smell of fresh bread from the bakery 2 blocks over. The town's quiet had returned, but it was a different quiet now, one that carried the residue of what had happened. From across the street, Phil stepped out of the hardware store and waved. "You'll take care now. And Earl, breakfast is on me next time." Earl gave a small wave back. "We'll see about that." Calvin's platoon brothers had already gone back to the National Guard facility, but the solidarity they'd brought into Mel's diner still lingered in the way people looked at Earl as they passed. A nod of acknowledgement here, a tip of the cap there. No one said much, but the respect was there, unspoken. As they climbed into the truck, Calvin glanced at his father again. "You've always been able to keep calm in the middle of things. I don't think I've ever seen you lose your temper." Earl chuckled softly. "Oh, I've lost it plenty of times. Just never when it would have made me lose more than I gained." They drove out of town, passing familiar storefronts and side streets. Calvin kept his hand steady on the wheel, his mind turning over what had just happened. Finally, he said, "Dad, I don't think people realize how much strength it takes to stay seated and not swing back." Earl's gaze stayed on the road ahead. "That's because most folks think strength is about hitting harder. Truth is, real strength is about knowing when not to." Calvin let the words settle. They didn't need to talk much after that. Back at Earl's house, the old man stepped out of the truck, pausing for a moment before heading up the porch steps. "You coming in?" Calvin shook his head. "I've got to get back to base, but I'll check in later." Earl gave him a firm nod. "Good. And Calvin, I'm proud of you." Calvin smiled. A rare, genuine one, before climbing back into the truck and driving off. Inside, Earl set his cap on the kitchen table and poured himself another cup of coffee. Alone now, he allowed himself one long breath, not of relief, but of satisfaction. The kind that comes from knowing you didn't just win an argument, you reinforced a principle. Because in the end, the real victory wasn't in making Murdoch apologize. It was in showing everyone in that diner, and maybe even some strangers online, that respect is worth standing up for and you don't have to throw a single punch to defend it. And that's the thing about moments like these. They ripple outward. Someone in that diner might treat the next person they meet a little better. Someone watching the video might think twice before letting their pride push them too far. Even Murdoch, whether he admitted it or not, would carry that morning with him. Respect is earned. It's defended. And when you defend it the right way, you set an example others can follow. If you've ever stood up for someone who couldn't or wouldn't defend themselves, you know exactly what that feels like. And if you haven't yet, maybe one day you'll get your chance. So remember this. When the moment comes, be the one who steps forward, not the one who looks away. And if you want more stories that show what standing up for the right thing looks like, the quiet courage, the real moments, make sure you subscribe. Because the next one might just change how you see strength.